The crate hit the floor of the containment bay with a heavy thud, and every single person in the room took one step back. I did not step back. I stepped forward. 9 sets of claws scraped against the metal from inside that crate, and the sound alone made 2 security guards grip their stun rods so tight their knuckles turned pale. The Vorthok hatchlings had been on the station for less than 10 minutes, and already the entire crew acted like a bomb had been wheeled into the room. "Ethan, get back from there," said Station Administrator Elena Voss, her voice sharp through the comm in my ear. She was watching from the control room above, safe behind reinforced glass, along with half the senior staff who had found urgent reasons to be anywhere else the moment this assignment came up. "I'm fine," I said. "Let me see them." "You saw the report. Bite force at hatching stage already exceeds 400 pounds per square inch. Claw length." I read the report, Elena, 3 times. She went quiet, which from her was as close to approval as I was going to get. The crate had come from a Vorthok trade vessel that suffered a reactor failure 4 days out from our station. The adults on board died trying to contain the leak. 9 eggs survived in a sealed hatching unit, and by the time rescue teams reached them, all 9 had already broken free of their shells. Newborn predators, fully mobile, fully alert, and completely without any adult of their own kind to guide them. Station law said orphan sapients received custodial care until their home government could send someone to collect them. Nobody had written that law with apex predator hatchlings in mind. But law was law, and someone had to physically stay in a room with 9 creatures capable of tearing through a standard door panel. I volunteered before anyone else in that meeting even lifted their head to make eye contact with the administrator. Now I stood in front of the crate as the release mechanism hissed and the front panel slid open. 2 eyes, then 4. Then a wall of eyes, arranged in 3 uneven rows across 9 narrow skulls, all fixed directly on me. They were smaller than I expected, maybe the size of a large dog, but built like something designed by a species that never lost a fight. Matte black scales that seemed to swallow the light around them. Long limbs coiled tight with muscle, jaws that unfolded sideways in a way no jaw on Earth was ever supposed to move. Every one of them was staring at me like I was either their next meal or their next problem to solve. I did not run. I did not raise my hands. I lowered myself down to their level instead, slow and deliberate, until my eyes were level with theirs. The nearest hatchling, smaller than the rest, but with a posture that screamed confidence, broke from the group first. She crossed the distance in half a second and clamped her jaw around my forearm. Pain shot up through my arm like fire, and somewhere above me, I heard Elena shout my name through the comm. I did not pull away. I had one piece of information working in my favor, buried on page 6 of a report nobody else had bothered to finish reading. Hatchling bite force, while already dangerous, was not yet lethal at this age. Their instincts were built for testing boundaries, not killing outright. What mattered most in these first moments was not whether I got hurt, it was how I reacted to getting hurt. Prey ran, prey screamed, prey pulled away in panic, which only taught a predator that resistance meant a fight worth finishing. So I stayed still. I let her hang there on my arm, jaw locked, eyes locked on mine, and I did something that confused her more than any struggle could have. I looked away. I picked up the tray of meat substitute the station's nutrition team had prepared and set it down 2 feet from us, like her bite was barely worth my attention. 5 seconds passed, then 10. I felt her grip loosen, not from exhaustion, but from confusion. Whatever she expected from me, boredom was not on the list. She let go. "Good girl," I said quietly, sliding the tray a little closer with my uninjured hand. "That's not how we say hello, this is." The other 8 hatchlings had gone completely still, watching her, waiting to see what she would do next. In Vorthok biology, the first hatchling to test a stranger set the tone for the entire brood. Whatever she decided in this moment, the rest would follow within hours. She lowered her head and ate. One by one, the others crept forward and did the same. Above me, through the glass, I saw Elena lower the tablet she had been gripping so hard her fingers had gone white. Nobody said anything over the comm for a long moment. "Camera feed just went to every terminal on this station," she finally said. "You're famous, Ethan." I looked down at the 9 hatchlings now crowded around the tray, jaws working through their first proper meal since their parents died. Let's just get them fed first, I said. Fame can wait. The days that followed were not gentle. Nobody warned me how often hatchlings tested boundaries, and I quickly learned that every single thing in that containment bay was a potential experiment to them. Chairs got flipped, cables got chewed through twice before I learned to run them along the ceiling instead of the floor. My left boot disappeared entirely during what I can only describe as a very determined game of tug, and never resurfaced. I named the smallest one Nora, since she had been the first to test me, and the first to decide I was worth trusting. The others followed her lead so closely that the station's xenobiologist, a quiet woman named Grace Bellamy, started referring to her as the anchor point of the whole brood. They orient around her, Grace told me one morning, watching through the glass as I distributed the morning meal. And she orients around you. That's unusual. Vorthok hatchlings are supposed to bond within their own species only. There's no recorded case of imprinting across species lines. Not once in 400 years of contact. Maybe nobody stuck around long enough to let it happen, I said, setting the last tray down as 8 hatchlings crowded in, leaving one gap that Nora filled a second later, shoving her way to the front like she owned the place. Grace made a note on her tablet without looking up. You should be more careful. Confidence read as calm to them so far, but if they ever sense fear from you, even once, the entire dynamic could shift. Predators do not forgive weakness easily. I understood that better than she realized. I grew up on a farm with working dogs, real ones, bred for guarding livestock against wolves, not for sitting pretty in a show ring. My father used to say that fear had a smell, and animals smarter than us could pick it out of a room before we even knew we were afraid. I had spent my whole childhood learning to walk into a pen of animals twice my size, without letting that smell ever reach them. 9 alien hatchlings were a much bigger challenge than a stubborn ram, but the principle held. By the second week, the bites had mostly stopped. Not because the hatchlings had grown gentle, but because they had stopped needing to test me. I had passed whatever silent exam they were running, over and over, every single day. By the 3rd week, something changed that nobody expected, least of all me. I walked into the containment bay one morning to find all 9 of them arranged in a loose circle around the door, waiting. The moment I stepped through, they crowded in around my legs, jostling for space, until Nora shoved her way through the pack and pressed her head against my knee. Grace watched the whole thing from the observation window, completely silent, her tablet forgotten in her hand. That's a greeting posture, she finally said over the comm, her voice tight with something close to disbelief. That's how Vorthok hatchlings greet a parent. Not a caretaker, a parent. I crouched down and scratched along the ridge of Nora's jaw, right where she liked it, and she made a low rumbling sound that I had never heard from her before. They don't have anyone else, I said. Somebody has to be it. Word of what was happening in the containment bay spread through the station faster than any official report could travel. People who had refused to even walk past the observation deck during the first week now found reasons to stop by and watch through the glass. Children from the residential ring pressed their hands against the window, fascinated by 9 creatures that had terrified every adult on the station only weeks before. Elena visited more often too, though she kept a careful distance from the door for the first several visits. The Vorthok consulate sent an update, she told me one afternoon, standing well back from the glass, while Nora chewed thoughtfully on the edge of my sleeve. Retrieval team arrives in 9 days, full extraction crew, trained handlers, the works. Good, I said, though something in my chest tightened at the thought. You don't sound thrilled. I am. They belong with their own kind. I paused, watching the pack settle into their afternoon rest pile, limbs and tails tangled together in a heap against my legs. I just want it to go well for them. A transfer like that could undo a lot of trust if it isn't handled carefully. Elena studied me for a long moment. You've grown attached. They're kids, I said simply. Doesn't matter what species. You spend enough time keeping something alive and safe, you start caring what happens to it next. She did not argue with that. She simply nodded and made a note to pass along to the retrieval team. A note I would later learn insisted on a slow, careful handover rather than a standard extraction. The final days before the retrieval team's arrival passed in a strange kind of calm. The hatchlings had grown noticeably larger already, their movements more coordinated, their curiosity less destructive and more directed. Nora had taken to following me step for step whenever I moved through the bay, and the others had settled into a loose hierarchy beneath her, one that Grace documented with growing fascination in reports that were quickly becoming required reading across 3 different science departments. I spent those final days teaching them small things that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with trust. I taught them to wait calmly while I prepared meals instead of crowding the tray the moment it appeared. I taught them to settle when I raised my hand, a gesture that took real patience to establish, given how quickly 9 sets of instincts wanted to override any command that did not come from immediate hunger. None of it was about control for its own sake. It was about giving them tools that would make their transition easier, skills that would let a team of strangers handle them, without triggering the kind of fear response that could turn a simple extraction into chaos. Grace pointed out, almost admiringly, that I was essentially raising 9 future ambassadors without any formal training in xenobiology at all. "You're doing this on instinct," she said, watching me settle the pack with a raised hand during what had become our evening routine. "Pure instinct, and it's working better than half the theoretical models in our archive. Instincts just experience you don't remember learning," I told her. "I learned this a long time ago, just not with anything from another planet." On the morning the retrieval ship docked, I felt a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with fear of the hatchlings and everything to do with the fear of losing something I had not expected to care about so deeply. The retrieval team came through the airlock in full protective gear, expecting, based on their briefing notes, a containment bay in some state of chaos. What they found instead stopped every one of them cold in the doorway. 9 hatchlings, now noticeably larger than the small, terrified creatures that had arrived weeks earlier, lay curled together in a calm heap near the center of the room. I sat cross-legged in the middle of them, tablet in hand, reviewing feeding schedules while Nora rested her head against my knee, exactly as she had every single day for the past 3 weeks. The lead handler, a tall man named Callum Whitfield, who had apparently overseen dozens of hatchling transports across his career, stood frozen in the doorway for a long moment before speaking. "They're calm," he said, his voice carrying the same disbelief Grace had shown weeks earlier. "I've never walked into a room with this many hatchlings and not needed a single restraint." "They don't need restraints," I said, keeping my voice easy and level, as 9 sets of eyes lifted toward the newcomers. "They need patience, same as anyone." Callum stepped further into the room, moving slowly, deliberately, the way I had taught myself to move all those weeks ago. Nora lifted her head, studied him for a long moment, with the kind of focused intensity that used to make grown security officers back out of the room entirely, then decided he was neither food nor threat, and settled back down against my leg. "Remarkable," Callum said quietly. "In 400 years of contact, I have never once seen a hatchling brood accept a stranger this fast, let alone accept an entirely different species as a caregiver in the first place." "They're not accepting a stranger," I said. "They already know their family. This is just the introduction to the rest of it." The transition took the better part of 2 days, handled with the kind of careful patience I had insisted on from the start. I stayed present through every stage, letting each hatchling grow comfortable with the handlers before any physical transfer took place, letting them see me speak calmly with each new person before trusting that person to come closer. By the second evening, all 9 hatchlings had accepted the retrieval team without a single incident, a result Callum described as statistically impossible based on every model his organization had ever built. On the final morning, as the crate that would carry them back to their home system sat prepared near the airlock, I crouched down one last time in front of the pack. Nora pressed her head against my palm, and the rumbling sound she made had become as familiar to me now as any word. "You're going to do great things," I told her quietly. "All of you are." Callum stood a respectful distance away, watching the moment unfold without interruption. When I finally stood and stepped back, allowing the transfer to begin, he approached with a data pad already prepared. "The consulate has been reviewing our reports since your first week with them," he said. "They would like to discuss a formal position, liaison to the Vorthak Hatchling Development Program. It would mean travel, training on our homeworld eventually, and yes, more of exactly what you just did here. I watched as Nora settled into her new enclosure, glancing back toward me one final time before curling up beside her siblings. I think I'd like that, I said. Elena, standing nearby with arms crossed and an expression somewhere between pride and disbelief, shook her head slowly. 3 weeks ago, this entire station was terrified of that crate, she said. Now half our senior staff want your job. They weren't terrified of the hatchlings, I said, watching the crate seal shut for transport. They were terrified of what they didn't understand yet. Turns out, understanding just takes time nobody wanted to spend. As the retrieval ship prepared for departure, I stood at the observation window and watched the transport vessel drift away from the station, carrying 9 creatures who had arrived as orphaned predators and were leaving as something closer to family. Grace joined me at the window, her tablet finally set aside for the first time in weeks. You know this changes everything, she said. Every future hatchling rescue is going to reference what happened here. Good, I said. Maybe next time somebody won't need to volunteer alone. The ship shrank to a small point of light against the stars, and I felt the tightness in my chest ease into something steadier, something closer to pride than loss. 6 months later, I stood on a landing platform on the Vorthak homeworld, waiting as a transport craft settled onto the tarmac. The doors opened, and 9 fully grown Vorthak, each now taller than me and moving with the effortless power of adults in their prime, filed out in a tight formation. The one in front broke away first, moving directly toward me with a familiar confidence that had not faded with age. Nora stopped in front of me, lowered her head, and pressed it gently against my chest, the same way she had every single day back on that station. I laughed and rested my hand against the ridge of her jaw, right where she still liked it. Look at you, I said. You did great. Behind her, the rest of the brood settled into a loose formation, watching the reunion with the same quiet patience I had once taught them, patience that had carried through every stage of their growth into something the consulate now called a benchmark for cross-species care. I had come here as a liaison, a job title that barely covered what the role had actually become. I trained new handlers. I consulted on hatchling programs across 3 different systems. I had even helped write the very first protocol for cross-species imprinting, something that did not exist before 9 frightened hatchlings arrived on a station. Nobody expected to know what to do with them. None of that mattered as much, in this moment, as the simple fact that Nora remembered me, that she had crossed a room full of officials and cameras just to press her head against my chest one more time. Sometimes the biggest difference in the universe does not come from grand gestures or impossible heroics. Sometimes it comes from one person deciding to stay calm in a room everyone else was too afraid to enter, and choosing, day after day, to show up anyway. I had volunteered because nobody else would. I stayed because somewhere between the bites and the boredom and the quiet trust that grew slowly across 3 difficult weeks, 9 creatures the entire galaxy feared had become something I would never have traded for anything. And as Nora settled beside me, watching the sun set over a world that was not my own, I understood that this was never really about predators at all. It was about showing up and staying until fear had no room left to grow.